What happens when a German ace, a hunter of the skies with the Knight's Cross within his reach, catches a defenseless, mangled American B-17 in his gun sights? In the cold, unforgiving heights of the European theater, the law of war dictated a simple outcome: destruction. But on December 20, 1943, high above the frozen landscape of northern Germany, the rules of engagement were replaced by a higher code of honor. This is the story of a moment of humanity in the midst of the most brutal conflict in human history. The date was December 20, 1943. The location, the airspace over Bremen, Germany. The units involved were the United States Army Air Force's 379th Bombardment Group and the Luftwaffe's Jägerschwader 27. On this day, two men from opposite sides of the world, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown and Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, would find their fates inextricably linked. One was a rookie pilot on his first mission as a commander. The other was a veteran ace with 22 victories to his name. What transpired between them would remain a secret for nearly half a century, a forgotten chapter of the war that challenged the very definition of an enemy. By late 1943, the Allied air campaign against Nazi Germany had reached a fever pitch. The mighty 8th Air Force was launching massive daylight raids deep into the heart of the Reich, targeting the industrial engines of the German war machine. These missions were perilous, often described as suicide runs, by the crews who flew them. The German Luftwaffe, though beginning to feel the strain of a two-front war, remained a lethal and sophisticated adversary. Their pilots were experienced, their tactics were honed, and their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were among the finest interceptors in the world. Enter Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown. At just 21 years old, Brown was the pilot of a B-17F Flying Fortress nicknamed Ye Old Pub, serial number 42 to 3167. He was a farm boy from West Virginia, soft-spoken but technically proficient. This mission to Bremen was his first as an aircraft commander. His crew was a cross-section of American life, men from the shipyards of the Pacific Northwest, the factories of the Midwest, and the small towns of the South. They were young, mostly in their early 20s, and many were facing their first true taste of combat. Opposing them was Oberleutnant Franz Stigler. Stigler was the antithesis of the Nazi propaganda poster boy. He was a devout Catholic, a former airline pilot, and a veteran of the desert campaigns in North Africa. By December 1943, he was a member of Jägerschwader 27, JG-27, stationed at Jever. Stigler was one of the old hairs of the Luftwaffe. He had lost his brother, August, early in the war, a pilot who had died when his plane crashed during takeoff. Stigler fought not for Hitler or the party, but for his comrades and his sense of duty. On this specific morning, Stigler was just one victory away from earning the Knight's Cross, the highest military honor in Germany. To him, another B-17 wasn't just a target, it was the final requirement for his nation's greatest recognition. The target for the day was the Focke-Wulf FW-190 aircraft factory in Bremen. It was a vital objective, heavily defended by hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, the dreaded 88s, and dozens of fighter squadrons. At 0800 hours, Ye Old Pub took off from RAF Kimbolton in England, joining a massive formation of hundreds of B-17s. As they crossed the German coastline, the sky began to fill with the black puffs of flak. The B-17 was known as the Flying Fortress for its ability to absorb incredible amounts of damage, but even its legendary ruggedness was about to be tested. The flak over Bremen was thick enough to walk on, as the veteran airmen used to say. At 27,000 feet, the temperature inside the unpressurized bomber plummeted to 60 degrees below zero. Ice formed on the crew's oxygen masks, and the bitter wind howled through the gaps in the fuselage. Just before the bomb run, a flak shell exploded directly in front of Ye Old Pub. The blast shattered the plexiglass nose, knocking out the No. 2 engine and damaging No. 4. The heavy bomber shuddered, losing speed and beginning to lag behind the safety of the combat box formation. Brown struggled with the controls, his muscles straining to keep the crippled aircraft level. Then, the German interceptors appeared. for 10 agonizing minutes. Ye Old Pub was the sole target of a swarm of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s from JG-11. The German pilots saw the straggler, a lame duck, and pounced. The roar of the B-17's remaining engines was drowned out by the rhythmic thumping of its .50 caliber machine guns as the waist gunners and tail gunner fought back. But the odds were impossible. 20mm cannon shells ripped through the aluminum skin of the bomber. The oxygen system was severed, and the internal communications lines were cut. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, was killed instantly when a shell detonated in his compartment. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Sam Blackford, and the right waist gunner, Sergeant Alex Yelesenko, were severely wounded, their blood freezing on the floor of the plane. Charlie Brown himself was hit in the shoulder by a fragment of steel. As the oxygen failed, he began to drift into hypoxia, a state of deadly confusion caused by the lack of air at high altitude. The Ye Old Pub rolled onto its back and entered a terrifying death spiral, plummeting toward the earth. The German pilots, believing the bomber was doomed, broke off their attack. Thousands of feet below, Charlie Brown regained consciousness just as the plane hit the denser air. With a Herculean effort, he and his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Spencer, Pinky, Luke, pulled back on the control columns. The B-17 leveled out just 2,000 feet above the ground, so low they could see the trees and the individual houses of the German countryside. The plane was a flying wreck. The rudder was half shredded, the nose was gone, and the left stabilizer was missing. One engine was dead, another was dying, and the third was vibrating so violently it threatened to tear itself off the wing. Ye Old Pub was now crawling through the air at barely 100 miles per hour, deep inside enemy territory. They were a lone American bomber flying at low altitude over one of the most heavily defended regions of the Third Reich. Every anti-aircraft battery and every airfield for miles would soon be alerted to their presence. Back at the Jever airfield, Franz Stigler had just landed. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 was being refueled and rearmed. He was smoking a cigarette when he heard the low, uneven drone of a heavy bomber. He looked up and saw the B-17 limping across the horizon. It was so low he could see the markings on its tail. Without hesitation, Stigler crushed his cigarette, sprinted to his plane, and roared into the sky. This was it. One more kill and the Knight's Cross was his. Stigler quickly closed the distance. As he approached from the rear, he prepared to thumb his cannon trigger. But as he got closer, his finger froze. He had never seen a plane still flying in such a state. Through his windscreen, he could see the tail gunner slumped over his twin guns, the compartment painted red. He could see the gaping holes in the fuselage, large enough for a man to crawl through. He could see the terrified faces of the crew through the windows, trying to tend to their wounded comrades. Stigler pulled his Messerschmitt alongside the B-17's wing, just a few yards away. He looked directly at Charlie Brown. Brown, dazed and bleeding, looked back in shock. He expected the German to finish them off. He told his crew to get ready, but there were no guns left to fire. The B-17's defensive armament was either jammed, frozen, or destroyed. They were completely at the mercy of the man in the black-crossed fighter. Stigler was a veteran of the North African campaign, where he had served under the legendary commander Gustav Rodel. Rodel had once told his pilots, "You are fighter pilots first, last, always. If I ever hear of any of you shooting at someone in a parachute, I will shoot you down myself." To Stigler, this B-17 was nothing more than a giant parachute. To shoot it down would be murder, not combat. He tried to signal Brown. He gestured for the American to land at a German airfield and surrender, or perhaps fly to neutral Sweden, which was closer than England. He shouted and pointed, his voice lost in the slipstream. But Brown, suspicious and confused by the lack of gunfire, didn't understand. He kept the Ye Old Pub pointed toward the North Sea, toward home. Stigler realized that if he let the bomber go, German coastal flak batteries would tear it to pieces the moment it reached the Atlantic Wall. He made a decision that, if discovered, would result in his execution by a firing squad for treason. He stayed with them. For the next 20 minutes, one of the most surreal sights of World War II unfolded in the skies over Germany. A sleek, camouflaged Messerschmitt Bf-109 flew in tight formation with a shattered, smoke-trailing B-17 flying fortress. Stigler positioned himself on the B-17's wing, shielding the bomber from the view of German ground observers and coastal batteries. To any German gunner looking up, it appeared as though the Messerschmitt was either herding a captured prize or was an escort assigned to the aircraft. Stigler's presence prevented the flak guns from opening fire, as they risked hitting one of their own aces. Inside the B-17, the crew was in a state of surreal terror. The wounded were screaming as the morphine thawed, and the healthy were watching the German pilot, waiting for the inevitable burst of cannon fire. "He's going to ram us," one crewman whispered. "No," another replied. "He's just watching us die." But Stigler wasn't watching them die. He was ensuring they lived. He flew with them all the way to the coastline. As they reached the open water of the North Sea, the immediate threat of German flak vanished. Stigler knew he could go no further. His fuel was low, and if Allied Spitfires caught him, he would be a sitting duck. Stigler looked over at Charlie Brown one last time. He pulled his hand to his forehead and offered a crisp, formal military salute. It was a gesture of respect from one warrior to another, a recognition of the bravery it took to keep that shattered wreck in the air. Then, he banked his Messerschmitt hard to the left and disappeared into the clouds, heading back to Germany. Left alone over the grey, churning waters of the North Sea, the crew of Ye Old Pub was far from safe. They had 250 miles of open water to cross with 2 failing engines and a dying crew. The hydraulic fluid was gone, meaning they had no brakes and would have to manually crank the landing gear down. Against all logic, the B-17 stayed airborne. Charlie Brown and Pinky Luke wrestled with the controls for 2 hours, their hands cramping in the cold. They crossed the English coast at low altitude, barely clearing the cliffs. They spotted an airfield, seething, the home of the 448th Bomb Group. With no flaps and only partial control, Brown brought the Ye Old Pub in for a landing. The plane touched down hard, bounced, and finally skidded to a halt at the very end of the runway. As the engines flickered out and the silence of the English countryside rushed in, the survivors realized they were alive. Ground crews rushed to the plane, horrified by the carnage they found inside. They couldn't believe the aircraft had stayed in the air, let alone crossed the sea. Upon his return, Charlie Brown was immediately debriefed. He told his superiors the incredible story of the German pilot who had spared them and escorted them to safety. He expected the story to be celebrated as a rare moment of chivalry. Instead, he was told to keep quiet. The High Command didn't want the Allied crews developing any sympathy for the Huns. They wanted the enemy to be seen as monsters, not men with codes of honor. The mission was classified, and the story of the escort was buried in the archives. In Germany, Franz Stigler also kept his mouth shut. He never reported the encounter, knowing that admitting he spared an American bomber would mean a death sentence. He finished the war as one of the elite pilots of JV-44, the Squadron of Experts, flying the Me-262 jet fighter. He never did receive the Knight's Cross for that mission, but he survived the war, eventually moving to Canada in 1953 to start a new life. For decades, the story remained a secret. Charlie Brown returned to West Virginia, eventually joining the Air Force as an officer and serving in the early years of the Cold War. But the memory of the German pilot haunted him. Who was he? Why did he do it? In 1986, at a reunion of the 379th Bomb Group, Brown decided he had to find the man who saved his life. He began a search that lasted 4 years. He wrote letters to military archives, placed ads in pilot magazines, and reached out to Luftwaffe veteran organizations. In 1990, he received a letter from British Columbia, Canada. It began, "I am the one." The two men met in a hotel lobby in Seattle later that year. When they saw each other, they didn't shake hands, they embraced. They became the closest of friends, calling each other brother. They spent the next decade traveling together, sharing their story with the world, a story of how, in the darkest hour of human history, two enemies chose to be humans first. Franz Stigler later said, "I didn't have the heart to finish those brave men. I flew beside them for a long time. They were trying desperately to get home, and I was going to let them do that. I could not shoot them down." Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler died within months of each other in 2008. They are remembered not for the number of planes they shot down, but for the one plane that wasn't. Their story remains a testament to the fact that even in the midst of total war, the human spirit and the concept of honor can transcend the borders of nations and the brutality of combat. The Ye Old Pub incident is now studied in military academies as a prime example of the higher call. The encounter between Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler serves as a powerful reminder that even in the most devastating of circumstances, the individual has the power to choose compassion over cruelty. While the statistics of World War II are often measured in millions of tons of steel and millions of lives lost, it is the small, quiet acts of humanity that truly define the legacy of those who fought. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.